Hi, this is Mark Schroeder from GSHC Surrogacy Agency, and today I'm speaking with Aadil Mangalji, who is a partner with Long Mangalji in Toronto, Canada, who's going to explain a little bit more about the immigration process in that country. Aadil, how are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Mark?
Excellent, fantastic. First question, can you explain what the difference is between a Canadian citizen and a Canadian permanent resident?
The difference is basically in the rights that you have in Canada. A citizen is considered an individual who's able to stay in Canada permanently. They are given a passport. They have all the rights of citizenship. They can vote. A permanent resident is not yet a citizen. So basically, we like to think of it as citizen light. They have the right to live in Canada. The big thing, though, is that they have to maintain their residency in order to maintain their status, which basically means that at the end of every 5 years, they will have to renew their residency. And at that point, they'll have to show that they were living in Canada for at least 2 out of those 5 years, or they were with a spouse, a Canadian citizen spouse overseas for at least 2 out of those 5 years. So you can essentially lose your PR status, but you cannot really lose your citizenship status.
And how about if the intended parent is a permanent resident of Canada and has a genetic link to the baby? What is the baby's citizenship status in that situation?
This is quite a bit different. There is no permanent residency by descent. Essentially, the baby has no status in Canada at that time, even if they are born to a permanent resident. Essentially, what has to happen is the permanent resident does have the right to sponsor a dependent child to Canada. And the sponsorship process can often take about up to a year. In the interim, if the baby does, if they want to bring the baby to Canada, they do have the child would enter as a visitor to Canada. If they don't require a visitor visa, they can just come in. If they are from a country that requires a visitor visa, they would have to apply for one and then come into Canada. And while the application is in process, the sponsorship application, they would have to maintain their temporary status for the baby during that entire time period. So there is no auto descent like we have in citizenship.
And what happens if there's no genetic link between the intended parent, who is a Canadian permanent resident, and the surrogate child?
So again, mostly in these instances where we're talking about adoptions that are happening in most instances. And basically we're back to the permanent residents always have to sponsor. So in the same way that if they have a biological child, they can sponsor them, you can also sponsor an adopted child. So they would go through the adoption proceedings overseas, become the legal adoptive parent, and then for Canadian purposes, they would bring the child to Canada on a temporary, usually a visitor application, and essentially they would then proceed to do a sponsorship application for that child. And again, it usually takes about a year to do the sponsorship of a dependent child. And at the end of that entire process, the child would become a permanent resident to Canada. And again, they would have to be in Canada for 3 out of 5 years, and then their parents would apply for citizenship for them.
And how about if the intended parent is not a permanent resident of Canada yet, but they're in the process of applying for their permanent residency?
So that's actually really interesting, because then nobody really has status in Canada. So if those Canadian intended parents are on some sort of temporary application, so for example, a visitor visa, they can bring the child in as a visitor. Also, if they have a work permit, they can also bring the child in as a visitor. They can apply to bring the child in as a visitor. And then they would add the child to their permanent residence application. It's very, very, very critical that they do declare that child on that permanent residence application, even if that application has already started. If they do not declare that child, it is almost a huge problem to declare them later and to sponsor them later. Basically, there's a provision of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which basically states, it's 117(9)D, that if you were not declared at that time and you were a dependent, then when they do try to sponsor you in the future, that you would not become a member of the family class. You would have to actually ask for humanitarian and compassionate exemption from this provision. So it is critical that if they are if they are applying to be permanent residents, they have an application process and then have a child, that child is declared prior to them actually formally getting their permanent residency. And that child will also have to go through medicals to demonstrate that they passed the medical provisions and is not medically inadmissible in any way.
And what are the healthcare options for a surrogate baby who is born to intended parents who are Canadian permanent residents?
So that's a great question, because it's really going to depend on the province that the individual is in. Generally, if they are born to permanent residents of Canada, if they are coming in on temporary applications, so like I said, for permanent residents, they do have to do a sponsorship. Until that sponsorship is finalized, that child is not a permanent resident of Canada. So basically, in most instances, they would be here as visitors. And I always state to individuals that it's best to be getting health insurance in that interim time period. That's the safest way to make sure that your child can get healthcare, because in most provinces, as visitors, they would not have access to universal healthcare that is here in Canada. For Canadian citizen children that are coming prior to them having their citizenship card, that's a little bit different before their citizenship certificate. Citizenship by descent, again, as I stated, is not an application. It actually is a grant. And when you're waiting for that citizenship certificate, you're still a citizen, you're just waiting for it. So it would be akin to being a Canadian citizen waiting for your passport. That's just a document that proves your status. And in those instances, as a Canadian citizen, you are eligible for Canadian healthcare in all provinces as long as you've resided for a certain period of time. So I think if it's for permanent residents and the child is a visitor to Canada, you want to ensure that you are getting health insurance. If you are coming in as a citizen, then you want to just make sure you meet the residency requirements of that particular province, and you will have access to healthcare.
Aadil, when do you recommend that intended parents first contact your office to get this process started?
So our recommendation is that once there is confirmation that the surrogate is pregnant and that they know that they want to be coming back to Canada, that we start the process. We cannot submit any documents or give anything to the government until the baby is actually born. However, when intended parents have the child in hand, they're pretty anxious to get back to Canada as fast as possible. And so what we do is we would provide a document list to individuals well before the birth date, because intended parents are usually very busy with a new child after that and don't want to be dealing with the paperwork. We get all the paperwork ready and cleared, and at least give a list of people, documents that they require for after the birth, to make sure that we have everything on hand. And this way we're able to put in an application as fast as possible after the birth. But one of the required documents that we will need in order to submit is definitely the birth certificate. And if there is an adoption taking place, then we would need confirmation of that adoption prior to submitting all these applications.
For Canadian intended parents who completed their surrogacy journey in the United States, they may have been given a pre-birth order or post-birth judgment documents. What exactly does your office need to complete the process?
We usually will provide a full document list, and it does change. When there are pre-birth orders, it does make it a little easier, like I alluded to, especially when it is when there's no biological connection. In those instances, we can see that the parents have been recognized as the child's legal parent at birth or even before birth. So that does make that issue a lot easier and stringent. And it just gives us our documents a little earlier. So if there is a pre-birth order, it is useful to us. However, we still cannot submit up until actually the birth has happened, but it doesn't provide, it does allow us to submit those applications faster, because that issue is already resolved.
When do Canadian intended parents need to return to Canada to complete this process, and how long do they have to stay?
So that's really interesting and has become very interesting during COVID because people don't want to be traveling as fast as possible, and they're often staying in the country that they're in because they don't want to put their baby at risk in terms of travel right now. It really depends on the status of the parent and the baby. So if it's a citizenship grant, for example, if it's a grant by birth, if they're Canadian citizens by biological connection or have parents recognized as legal parents at birth, they can start applying for the citizenship certificate from anywhere, and you can start it right away. They do not have to be in Canada. If they are permanent residents and they are doing a sponsorship application, then they do have to be in Canada. A citizen can sponsor from overseas, but a permanent resident cannot. So a permanent resident has to be living in Canada when the sponsorship process goes into place. So they would have to return to Canada and put in the sponsorship application at that time.
Aadil, we talked about a lot of statuses today, whether it's a Canadian citizen or Canadian permanent resident, whether there's a genetic link or no genetic link. How can intended parents get a more accurate idea of the costs associated with this process?
Because we've spoken about so many, we're kind of all over the maps. And what I have found is that although these processes seem to be very siloed, it's very different depending on almost every family and what their goals are, what their biological connections are, what their birth story is, when they want to be coming to Canada. So the way that we have set it up is that we do provide consultations for intended parents prior, even often when they're actually considering surrogacy, so that they understand what's happening. And from the consultation, we come up with an immigration plan, and it's there that we would provide a fee structure for exactly how much everything would cost. And so parents are never surprised going into the process. All of our fees are done as fixed rates. So we don't do hourly rates, we do fixed rates on our fees, and we inform people of it well in advance.
This has been a conversation with Aadil Mangalji, a partner at Long Mangalji in Toronto, Canada. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate talking to you.
Thank you. It was great, and I'm really happy to speak to you guys about all of these issues and these topics because I find them fascinating myself, and would be happy to speak to anybody about this further, about their own individual cases in a consultation.
GSHC.